Today's lesson is about buying property on leased land. And you might think, wow, leased land. Yeah, you can actually own property, but not own the land. So most property you buy is what we call fee simple. And fee simple means you own the entirety of the property. So you own the land, you own the structures, you even own under the land. So the minerals and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes you only own above the surface, but you don't own the mineral rights. That's common when a family or a group or a company owns a huge piece of land and they want to retain the mineral rights because they want to keep digging, exploring, whatever for whatever they can extract. So, for example, I owned a home where I owned the actual home. I owned above the surface, but I did not own the mineral rights. And that was when I lived on Sepulveda and Anza. The Dominguez family from way back in the 1800s still controlled the mineral rights. And then eventually they sold them back, or the estate or whoever controlled, it was actually the Dominguez company. They sold back all the mineral rights to each owner, probably because there was not much left to the value of those mineral rights. But it's nice to own above and below the ground. So now sometimes you own what's above the ground, but you don't actually own the ground. So for example, in the Palm Springs area, or what they call the Coachella Valley, Indian tribes often retain the land, the actual property, the land, but they lease it back to, say, a builder who wants to build a community. And that's super common in Coachella Valley. You'll also see it a little bit in Huntington Beach. Properties that are by the water often are still on leased land, still leased by the family who owned the original plot of land. We even see it here in San Pedro, California. And if you live in another area, I'm sure I'm describing the Indian tribes because they're the most common holder of land. The other most common one is the federal government. So it could be even a local government retained the ownership of the land, but leased it back to a builder, most likely, or some other group that wants to use above ground. So often these are condos, but they can also be a planned community. So single family homes within, we'll call it a gated community. That's often the case as well. So the lease payment is usually, so you're leasing the land and then you're paying that organization that still owns the land. Usually the leases are for 99 years. And I can't remember the reason why it's not more than 99 years, but the leases normally are 99 years and they are renewable usually. So because, for example, the tribe doesn't go away, right? There's still a tribe 100 years from now, and the federal government, God willing, is still around 100 years from now. So they make really long leases. So the lease payment itself, in the case of a community, is divided between all the owners. So in a condo community, each condo owner pays a certain percentage of that lease payment, depending on how many units are in the community. And it usually goes up with inflation. I'll give an example. So the property that I own in the Desert Princess Country Club in Cathedral City, which is part of Coachella Valley, California, area called Coachella Valley. The city is actually Cathedral City. So my lease to the Indian tribe started off at 114. Every 5 years, it increased a certain percentage. So now, so that was in 2001. I think I forgot to mention that. So now in 2020, the payment is 143. And it ends in 2064. So that lease has been going on for a while. And what's interesting is that lease started in 1987, or the community was built in 1985. So they probably leased the land and then started developing it. My unit in particular was built in 1985. So it's less than 100 years, but it's very possible that the lease started before. But it doesn't have to be a 100-year lease. It could have been an 80-year lease or something. And it's not coming to mind how long it was. So the things to look for when you're buying something that's on leased land, first of all, you want to look at when the end of the lease is. So is it, 2064, 2032, 2084. So look for the end date or look for the term of the lease and the beginning date. Then look to see if it has automatic renewals or if you have to give constructive notice of renewals. So meaning you have to write to them, tell them you want to renew it, etc. So figure out when the payment goes up, because especially if this is going to be an investment property, you're calculating your return. You want to make sure that you're calculating the correct payment, and then who it's owed to. So who is it? Is it a tribe? Is it the federal government? Maybe look into who you're paying, right? And maybe even how many other communities they have and have they renewed. Because the big thing is, if you don't own the land and they don't renew your lease, whatever's on that land becomes their property. So that's a really important factor. If let's just say you're wanting to build your dream home and it happens to be on leased land, first of all, you're spending $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 building the home, maybe less if you're in another state, but whatever number works for you, you're spending some significant money building a home, and then it could be that in 20 years, that lease expires. They don't renew it. Now they own the property. So that's the biggest risk, is the lease runs out and you no longer own the improvements that you made above ground on that land. So some of the terminology you need to know is the lessor is the landlord. The lessee is the tenant. So the lessor is the person who owns the asset and can lease it out. Like when you lease a car, you're a lessee because you received the asset that you're leasing, right? You received the rights to use that asset. So what's also important about leased land is if you're trying to finance it, first of all, some banks do not want to lend on leased land at all. So you want to be cautious of that if this is something you want to do. But the general Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rules, which most lenders are going to follow, the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rules are that the lease must subordinate as a lien on the property. So in other words, the lease on the land cannot be in first position. The mortgage has to be in first position. So for example, some solar companies do not want to subordinate. So some people are having trouble refinancing because that is a lease on your property. You're leasing the panels. So it's much better to buy the panels, by the way, if you're going to do that. But if you're leasing the panels, now that lease has to subordinate to a new mortgage. The lease must terminate after the loan term. So if you're getting a 30-year mortgage, the lease needs to be for 31 or 32 or more than 30 years because the lender doesn't want the lease to expire before their loan expires, which makes total sense, I'm sure, to you. So if you're trying to refinance and you're on leased land and your lease ends in 28 years, what I recommend you do is find a lender. Like, for example, what we do is we make the new mortgage, instead of a 30-year mortgage, we make it a 27-year mortgage. That way your mortgage ends before the end of the lease and you can get the very fancy super low rates that are around these days. Okay, so the lease also cannot exclude any protected classes. So for example, they can't say no one under 55 may live here. That is okay if you're a regular condo complex, but if you're trying to get financing on leased land, they cannot exclude any protected classes, which is the whole race, religion, sex, marital status, national origin, ancestry, all those things are protected classes. So if the lease excludes anything like that, they either need to strike it out, which is pretty tough to do, to go back on a lease that's existed for 20 years, let's say, and say, oh, by the way, you need to cross this out, because they can discriminate any way they want. As far as a tribe goes, not so much as the federal government. So it's unlikely the federal government has that in their lease. But just beware of that, because if it is a tribal lease, then you're going to make sure of that. Then, and I mentioned some lenders just won't do this kind of financing because it can be very tricky, right? You're looking for all kinds of stuff in that lease. So if you're going to buy property on leased land, keep all those things in mind. And that's it for our little lesson for today. I hope you enjoyed how to how to smartly buy property on leased land.